Okay. Who's that over there? Omar? Don't you think it's time we took the Christmas tree down?
Well, I tried suggesting it. But,
Huh?
I tried suggesting it, but supposedly it's meant to stay out for Chinese New Year.
This is total cultural fusion here. We have Christmas trees and Chinese New Year's. Okay. Welcome back, everybody. We've been gone almost exactly 2 months. Our last lecture was 10 December, and now we're into 11 February. Time went really fast. I don't know how people spent that time. We had a pretty good, almost a full month Chan retreat here at the Berkeley Buddhist Monastery, right? It was 3 to 4 weeks?
3 weeks.
3 weeks. 3 weeks of quiet winter Chan. And then I took some time to work with our group of translators. We finished up a pretty polished rough of the complete essay by Hanshan De Ching called Wandering in a Dream. And so we have that available now. And soon what we'll do is bring it out with Chinese and English interface, and then footnotes and a long introduction. And I've been enjoying going into the introduction and looking at his life. Amazing life, Hanshan De Ching. Roughly, in our measured time, about the time of Shakespeare in the Western sense, Ming Dynasty. Fascinating scholar practitioner, and maybe sometime in the future we'll come back to that as a lecture series here again, now that we have it fully translated. But I must say, after 3 weeks of Chan and then immersing oneself in a text from the Ming Dynasty, really hammer on nail talk about what it means to cultivate and how to regulate your mind, and actually Chan cultivation as a way of being, not just simply a practice, but a whole lifestyle. It's very thorough, very deep, and very accessible. For me, the time goes really quickly. I feel like with those texts and the individuals that make those texts, hanging out with them is a very rare and precious experience. Very satisfying. I enjoy translating a lot. I don't know that I'm particularly good at it, but we have a good group that collectively comes at it with good Chinese skills, good research skills, and pretty good English skills. So the combination of 5 to 8 people working in consort like that, I think brings out a pretty good translation. And anyhow, so now I'm back to other things, which in some ways are more tiring than translation, but also good work too. We've just started classes at the university again. We had to go 2 weeks sort of in not shut down, but online long distance because of the virus, the threat of the virus. But this coming week, at least I'll be going up and starting in person. Partially in person, it's masked in person, so I get to see the eyes, but not the rest of the face. But it'll be good, because our particular form of education really does require face-to-face human interaction, embodiment. This is not something that just passed along rhetorically or in text or even long distance. It has to be seen and felt, immersed in directly to get what it's all about. And I don't think this is ever going to change from ancient times to the present. This particular teaching as a way of life, of a way of being, requires that kind of intimate sensibility and reading. And it's it's passed along or conveyed not just in the content, but even more in the character of the interchange of the people doing it. So this is very hard to replicate online. Nonetheless, we'll continue Friday night for, I don't know how long, indefinitely online before them. Any talk of the monastery opening up again, or? Okay, not for a while. We are on, let's see, maybe page 15. I'm not sure. I'm looking at the text. Oh no, I've got about page 35.
Yeah, that's right.
35?
Yeah, 34, 35.
34, 35, and we're into, last lecture I remember we did quite a bit on karma. So tonight we're going to continue, try to do the next two verses, slowly reading them in Chinese, and then the translation. And it's the Yi Chang Xin Yao Fu, that passage. Got it?
Yeah.
You don't have it?
Yeah, I have it.
Oh, I'm looking at the people here. They should have a copy. Just to correct my Chinese, because if I say it in Chinese, you don't have a copy, you won't understand it at all. You finding copies?
I'm trying.
At least 4 copies.
Okay, 1 second. Found 2. I'm gonna try and find 2 more.
Okay, well, he's digging up other copies. Let's try to, page 35. Sancho Wu. Now we got it? Okay. 一场信仰佛，其心不退转，心尽诸如来，如是业应作。Next verse is 只要佛功德，其心永不会，不退，诸永清凉回，如是业应作。Okay, roughly translated. So, thoughts of constant faith or trust and joy in the Buddha, and a mind that never retreats. One draws near to all thus come ones. This is the karma that should be done. With a will, let's see what that is. With a will that rejoices in the Buddha's merit and virtue, a Buddha's merit and virtue, and a mind that never retreats, one dwells in pure, cool wisdom. This is the karma that should be done. Just making some adjustments here as we go along. I'm sticking to, well, you have, it's very interesting. The original translation, one draws near to all thus come ones, is plural, but the Buddha is singular. And I would prefer to leave it as a Buddha rather than the Buddha. Thus come ones plural, Buddha plural. That's not only consistent with the Avatamsaka, where you have thus come ones and Buddhas, many, many, many nayutas of them, but you also importantly convey the sense of the universal availability of full awakening that any living being can have. So therefore it's not just limited to one Buddha. So tonight in the time we have, maybe I'm going to try to pay attention, unless you guys have questions, I'm going to pay attention to this idea of faith. That's the shin. Let's see what the character is. Shin, fourth tone. Actually a picture of a person standing next to words. And then the idea of joy. What's the Chinese that's for the joy there? Yao, right? Yao is the joy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
And then bu tui, not retreating. So just looking at those. I would translate faith more like confidence or trust rather than faith itself. And this means something quite different with these teachings, with the Buddhist teachings, than it does as it's used in other traditions. It's not completely different. There's an overlap, but there's a very distinct difference of the use of faith here. Generally, it refers to a trust or a confidence in three levels. It said the teacher, the teachings, and oneself. This gets a little more complicated in that if one doesn't have a teacher, then basically, I think, it comes down to the other two, to the teachings and yourself. And this is corresponding to in the Mahaparinibbana Sutra, where Ananda asks the Buddha, you are leaving, you're dying, you're passing away. It's a case that we won't have a teacher anymore. What are we to do? And the Buddha actually kind of scolded Ananda a little bit and said, you're not looking at it correctly. He didn't simply say, oh, when I'm gone, take the Dhamma Vinaya as the teacher, which he did say. But before he said that, he said, you're not looking at it correctly, Ananda. And that raises a really interesting question for this tradition, because the question is, some people say, well, where does authority reside once the Buddha is gone? But an equally interesting question is, and I think that's what's implied in the Buddha's answer, where does authority abide when the Buddha is here? In other words, some people say, well, where does authority reside in the absence of the Buddha? I would ask the question, where does authority reside in the presence of the Buddha? And I think that's why the Buddha said to Ananda, you're not looking at it correctly, because even when I'm here, I did not place myself as the authority, but asked you to look deeply into your mind and your teachings and find the deepest form of authority, which is your own awakening, your own intrinsic wisdom. And you see this again where Ananda comes up in the Shurangama. He leaves home and starts to cultivate, purely following the awesomeness of the Buddha. And then that doesn't get him very far. He ends up, I won't go into the whole story, but he ends up in a kind of difficulty that's brought about because he isn't really cultivating his mind. He's simply following the authority and the presence of the Buddha. And even in the Shurangama, the Buddha pushes Ananda back and says, unless you do this yourself, nothing's going to happen here. You cannot get awakened simply by imitating me or, sort of sliding in on my robes. So in both cases here, this is a very different approach. In some traditions, the authority goes back to the original deity or teacher, and then everything is derivative from there, and everything's checked out. I don't think that's the case with these teachings. The authority and the authenticity resides in the Dhamma Vinaya, and that resides in the cultivation of that, and the full realization of that is the ultimate, how shall I say, validation of the authority. So replicating the awakening experience of a Buddha is the ultimate tool for authenticity and authority in this tradition. So it's a living, ongoing. And even if you read the text very clearly, you can see the Buddha was doing that throughout. He was constantly putting his disciples, the monks and the nuns, back onto their own cultivation, their own understanding, their own investigation, knowing for themselves, through themselves, by themselves. And that's where authority ultimately was going to. So even when the Buddha was present, he eschewed himself being set up as the authority. This is a very interesting exchange. In fact, then Ananda says, do you have some final teaching to give us? This is in the same text I was talking about. And the Buddha said, gosh, you guys, I mean, not exactly literally, but gosh, you guys, what do you think? I'm holding something back? I taught you everything. It's not like I have something in my clenched fist. He uses that metaphor that I'm holding back. Time is short, cultivate. You've got everything you need. Don't look to me further. I haven't held anything back. So in any event, what I'm saying here, this confidence, this trust, is most importantly in the Dhamma Vinaya, in the teachings and the moral code. And not just the moral code, but the moral sensibility, the ethical sensibility, the heart of Shila. How are we to know? How are you to figure out what to do, what's right or wrong? You have an innate capacity to do that, and cultivation is using the formal precepts as a springboard into the deeper precepts of the nature. So the formal precepts are kind of a holding, but the actual precepting is going into the embodiment of those, even almost before or without need of holding anymore, because you become the precepts. You become so centered. Wei Nang uses a phrase, you become trued, T-R-U-E-D. You become so trued that you don't even have an impulse or a tendency not to stay on true course, not to stay centered. That's the precepts of the nature, it's called. So here I think if we go Dharma Vinaya as the teacher, both of these imply an active, engaged cultivation. And that's why I think faith, if you want to use that word for xin, in Buddhism is not a substitute for reason, but it's an enhanced form of full reason. It's something that is not final. In other words, the goal is not to arrive at faith as a final goal, but it's actually to have faith as operative, as functional. So when the Avatamsaka says faith is a source of the way, it doesn't say it's the end of the way. It's merely the initiating impulse. And it's actually, in a sense, hypothetical. So if you look at the turnings, the three turnings of the Four Truths, built in there is a notion of faith that's very interesting. The Buddha says, I have understood this, he declares, these four truths. Then the second turning is, I encourage you to also experiment with this, which is in a sense the faith, the hypothetical. Try. Ehipassiko. Consider this, take this up, look into this. And then the third one, which is the actual confirmation through your own direct experience of the first true of the four that you know for yourselves, that's where faith in the end becomes gnosis or understanding. Faith is replaced by direct understanding or gnosis, prajna. And so then faith is like a raft that you use to get to the other shore. Once you reach that other shore, faith is no longer operative or functioning because it's fulfilled its purpose. That's very different than that you just have and hang on to faith. Faith in the Dharma is not something you have, it's something you do. It's the ground from which you run the experiment. There's a confidence involved, but it's not an end in itself. It's a means to something. So it's a kind of inspired engagement that has trust at its deep root, but it is not ending with mere trust. It ends with insight, with understanding, with awakening. So I kind of stress this because sometimes people feel that faith, whatever they think faith is, just kind of belief is sufficient. It's not. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. All of the teachings, including concepts of faith, are operative. They're functional. They're meant to be used to engender something else, to realize something else. There never ends in themselves. So this is, again, we go back to the parable of the raft. You can see where faith would just be another form of raft. I would also say faith is not blind. Sometimes people talk about blind faith. And it's not a substitute for reason. I think it's actually a refinement of reason. By reason, I mean here, taking in the whole modality of knowing and understanding that we have available. Sometimes the language is used colloquially, heart and mind. Heart and mind. And by heart, I don't simply mean passions and feelings, although that's included. But heart has something to do with more emotional and moral completeness, distinguished from just intellectual. It's almost like one's innermost character, feelings, and inclinations that are experienced, attuned, refined, subtle over time. This is how we really operate. Yes, we use the intellect. Yes, we use reason. And it's a very effective, useful tool of inquiry, but it's also a limited tool of full inquiry, of full understanding. In the end, I think when the Buddha has his awakening, or when Hui Neng says, how unexpected, and he announces his awakening, what he's saying is, finally the full modality of his being grasped and took in awakening. It wasn't like, oh, that's interesting, or I had this thought. But there was a fundamental transformation of mind, body, emotion, feeling, intellect, intuition, and everything. It all hummed. It was like a well-tuned instrument. Everything came into tuning. This is what I think awakened understanding is about. It's not merely intellectual, theoretical apprehension or speculation, but it's actually a transformed, viscerally, intellectually transformed understanding. You are no longer the same person anymore with that experience. At every level, how you feel, how you see, how you hear, how you smell, everything is different with this kind of understanding. I think this is, if you look at there's a French expression, le cœur a ses raisons que la raison ne connaît point. Basically, the heart has its reasons that reason does not understand. But if you look at this, it's very interesting. Some people say love is blind. That's what it means, simply put. But that's a very coarse, actually, translation of what this means. Because in French, the verb sort of like savoir has to do with intellect only. To know, say, savoir. But here, connaît is used. And connaît in French means it's much more personal, it's intuitive, it's embodied. So it's actually, and Pascal gave this expression. Pascal wasn't talking about a romantic relationship. He was talking about his understanding of the divine, of God. And he said, le cœur, this full capacity of the personal, intuitive, embodied, the deep dimension, the heart's core, knows what reason cannot really know. So he was somewhat mystical in this, and what he was saying was that the deep understanding of the fullness of the universe and how things work, in his view, God and God's creation, can only be apprehended with the fullness of your being, which was the deep heart. It's closer to what in Chinese would be the xin. It's not simply the emotions or feelings, but it's a full faculty of intellectual, emotional reasoning, sensibility. It comes into alignment. So that's why I would use trust or confidence here, but also just have a little discussion about what faith means in this tradition or these teachings. Then just a little bit on if you don't have the teacher, and even if you do have a teacher, according to the teachings, the Dhamma Vinaya, you still examine that teacher on the basis of the Dhamma Vinaya. So the teacher says, oh, I believe or I think it's this way. And the Buddha says, even if the Buddha says it, you don't just embrace it automatically, nor do you reject it. He says, no, don't treat it with scorn, no rejection, but pause and investigate and think it over. Does it accord with the teachings? Does it accord with the Vinaya? If it accords with the teachings and the Vinaya, it's not absolutely certain still, but it's a pretty good indicator. But if it doesn't, it's an absolute indicator that whatever that person says, however enlightened they seem to be, it's not Buddha Dharma. It's not Buddha Vachana, the word of the Buddha, Buddha's word. So even if you have a teacher, you still have to use the check and balance mechanism of checking that with the Dhamma Vinaya, and also, to the best you can, your own inherent wisdom and discernment. So this is, again, you see, it's something you're doing. It's not a given. It's not just a done deal. You're constantly engaging and questioning and inquiring. Because if you just trust yourself, you can see how that could be like a stool with only one leg. If you just trust the Dharma, you trust the Dhamma Vinaya and the teacher, but you don't have any trust in yourself, it's still not going to stand. Because it's still based on a kind of blind faith, not a tested faith. So you need three. There's a trilogue going on between the teachings and the Dhamma Vinaya, between the teacher and yourself. Very interesting. So this is for inquiring minds. But at the same time, that trust in yourself has to be a trust in, the text say that your confidence or almost your intuitive sense that you have a potential for something deep and profound, fully liberated. The Buddha nature, it's called. And if you don't have some confidence that that's a capacity, it's very hard to go forward. It doesn't mean that you're there. It simply means you have the confidence to trust it enough to give it a really full attempt at realization. Because you won't even start if you have that negativity to begin with. You think, oh, I can't do it, it's not possible, I can't. Then no matter how good the teachings and no matter how good the teacher, nothing's going to come of that. It's not pride, it's not arrogance, but it's a quiet, deep, almost rock solid conviction that's actually soft and vulnerable. It's not hard. That's what allows for not retreating. Because once you have the teachings and you know they're reliable and you have some confidence in your capacity, then you can pretty much deal with anything that comes. With just patience and persistence, it will work. But without confidence in that, it won't. Let me read you a passage. This is from Master Juri. Juri was a famous Tentai teacher. And this is coming from his text called the Shaozhi Guan, which is the lesser or the smaller stopping and contemplating text. And he said the first obstacle, when you're starting to cultivate, it's really important to sweep the obstacles away as much as possible. When you cultivate, actually, obstacles will come up that you don't even see at the beginning. And that's where confidence and whatnot will carry you again. But at the beginning, he said the first obstacle is to doubt yourself. And I'm quoting you. He says, the first obstacle is to doubt yourself. If you say over and over to yourself, I'm stupid, I'm a dull person, my previous karmic offenses are sullying, dirtying, polluting, deep and severe, no one else is as bad as I am. Maybe I'm not up to this. He's saying, if you say yourself like this, if you generate this kind of doubt, you will go nowhere in your practice. Don't make so little of yourself, since the good deeds of past lives are just as immeasurable as these offenses that you feel you have. So this is both a kind of word of encouragement, but it's also deeply therapeutic. Most of us fall into two traps. We either overestimate or underestimate ourselves. And both of them, the obstacle of pride is the overestimation, but the obstacle of doubt is the underestimation, the inferiority thing. And sometimes it passes because it seems like religious humility. Oh, I'm no good, I'm so bad, I'm sinful like a never. And it looks like you're penitent and humble. But actually it's a kind of pathological attachment. And it's an impediment to your own awakening and understanding. It's as deadly as pride. Both of them freeze you in your tracks and there's no way to go. So in pride, there's no place for anything to go in. And in the opposite, in this inferiority, there's nothing to kindle. There's nothing to kindle, there's nothing to build on. Because you keep emptying out any potential you have with your screwed up thinking. Another quote, this is Master Hua, when he was giving an explanation of the Amitabha Sutra. And the Amitabha Sutra is the idea that one can be reborn, and it doesn't say when. It could be reborn in a thought, or in a next life, or in this life, in a land that is pure, in a realm that is pure, called the pure realm or the pure land. And we have to understand in this tradition, the pure realm or pure land is not a final goal at all. It's merely a more conducive place to continue cultivation. Sometimes when we create a boundary in a sacred space for a retreat, we're creating a mini pure land. And in that, everybody's taking vows to eat pure food and not hassle each other and not fight and compete. And, it's a pretty precepted, spiritually supportive environment. That's kind of a beginning Pure Land. So in the Pure Land talks Master Hua was giving, he says, he's talking also about this idea of believing in oneself. And he says, what does it mean to believe in oneself? It's to believe that you certainly have the qualifications necessary to gain entry into this pure realm. Don't take yourself lightly and say, and again it's almost a repeat of Jiri, I've committed so many offenses, I can't be born there. My karma's too heavy. Sometimes I hear this as sincere regret. Often I hear it as a game stopper. So it's sort of like, therefore I don't have to put any effort because my karma's too heavy. Maybe next life, mañana, siempre mañana. If you have heavy offense karma, you now have a good opportunity. And he said, at the time, a good opportunity to repent and renew. Because one of the most powerful mechanisms in this teaching is the prospect and the possibility and the mechanism that allows a return, a cleansing, a renewal. This is like so important. Because if it didn't have that, it would all be fated and predestined. We would just be on a mechanistic, predetermined track without any. So the whole Dharma rests on the ability of change, and change rests on the ability to correct one's steps, shusheng. And that means those that are correct steps, you're able to maintain them. Those that aren't, you're able to change them. Without that, it's dead in the water. So he said, you can not only change them, but it's this very interesting line. He says, if you have heavy offense karma, you have a good opportunity to get rid of it, or you can take it with you to the pure realm. Regardless of the offenses you've committed in the past, if you change your mind and heart and reform your conduct, that's a key line. If you change your mind and heart, reform your conduct, you will be reborn there, offenses and all. So this is Master Hua's take on this idea that the sea of offenses, the sea of pollution and suffering is vast. A turn of the head is the other shore. The turn of the head is this, basically changing the heart and the mind. Once that's done, the direction is more or less set. Now it's going to take some time possibly to work through all of that. But the direction has changed. That's the other shore. That's why it says the turn of the head is the other shore. Even though the time between the changing and the realization may be short or long. Once the direction is changed, everything changes from that. This is the power of the mind and its change. And again, this thing goes back to this theme that's coming here of not retreating. Not retreating is basically, once that resolve is made, continue. Don't retreat. Don't retreat on the basis of pride. Don't retreat on the basis of unconstructive doubt of inferiority. Don't retreat on the basis that it seems to be taking a long time, or you're having some experience that you do have, in fact, heavy karmic. I have heavy karmic offenses. None of that should be any grounds for retreat. This is really, really critical, because once you do that, for sure, these teachings say you will arrive. The only thing that stops you is yourself. A mind that stops, gives in, yields. Wow. Any questions on that before we go on? And I'm assuming that one of you are going to talk as well tonight. So any questions on that, on the interpretation of faith or any of the things? And if I spoke wrongly, any corrections?
Marty, one
Two questions, go ahead.
You mentioned trusting ourselves, right?
Trusting ourselves.
Ourselves, right? But sometimes I know that I believe that we kind of trust our instinct.
We can what?
Instinct.
Drop it, then I can hear you.
Okay, instinct, our instinct.
Uh-huh.
You know, but sometimes this kind of what arises in the heart is not examined, is impulsive, and is kind of hidden desire, what kind of so what you can recommend to how to distinguish between this kind of false advisor in the heart of thinking, yeah, this is right to do, and this is I listen to myself, or this kind of true knowing advisor, that kind of space in the heart and mind that knows what is true in the moment.
The trust yourself is a deep trust, conviction in that capacity for full awakening, for full goodness, full compassion. That doesn't mean that every impulse and every thought and every idea that comes up is coming from that place. So trusting yourself is not, in a sense, replacement for discernment. It has to work with it. And over time, with the basic confidence that I do have the whole and complete there, even though it's being used incorrectly, even though I've neglected it and let it, be overgrown with weeds and whatnot, I can go back, I can return, I can get it. So what cultivation is constantly keeping that as your pole star, and then dealing honestly with everything that comes up in between that obstructs, that obscures that makes it seem like it's not there anymore. But it doesn't mean immediately everything that comes from your immediate reaction, impulse, habituation is trustworthy. In fact, it's probably not. But without some kind of basis that there is a juxtaposition to compare and contrast those, you're lost. So this self that's being talked about here is basically what's called true self. And the conditioned self, the false self, is the one that has to be rubbed and polished against this true. So this is what cultivation is. But without that initial ground of confidence, you have nothing to steer by. But even if you have something to steer by, it's not like a Tesla with automatic drive. Well, maybe it is, because Tesla automatic drive goes all over the place, because it's not refined yet. So you can't go on autopilot until you are absolutely, well, when some texts say until fourth stage of arhatship, can you trust your own mind, yourself? The great passage from Confucius, he said, when I was 15, I set my heart on learning, but not until 70 had I cultivated myself so much that I could trust my first impulses, my desires, he says, my likes and dislikes, and not overstep and not make a mistake. So between 15 and 70, there's a lot of discernment and cultivating going on. So I hope that sort of addresses it. In some ways you could say it's a struggle or a pushing hands with the ujjarsha and the shanjarsha of your own nature. So the sixth patriarch talks about we have a good and knowing advisor within. But if we're morally dissolute and we don't follow precepts and we don't cultivate ourselves, that good knowing advisor is not available to us. What we have is an Ujjashur, a bad knowing advisor that we're following. He said, so therefore, you have to find an external good knowing advisor to correct this. Don't mistake it, he says, and say, oh, we absolutely need an external good knowing advisor. He says, no, you don't. Unless you've really mucked up your inner good knowing advisor. But again, you see the premise there, it's there. It's not like it's outside and you have to go seek it. So the confidence you get is to know it is intrinsically whole and complete, even though it's a little rusty and a little mucked up. That's a very different orientation than saying, I don't have it to begin with. Therefore, I must seek it outside. That's where you really get lost. So there's a kind of deep faith and confidence and also a deep suspicion and discernment that goes on. And that's what cultivation is. And it's an art. And the thing about it is, you might be able to fool somebody else, but you'll never be able to fool yourself in that way. Self-deception is not possible, by definition. Because deceive means to pull the wool over. I mean, how can you pull the wool? How can you self-deceive? Doesn't make sense. So in this sense, I think that pretty much covers it, if that helps. And in fact, those impulses and reactions and habits that are really messed up are actually sort of the good knowing advisor out of shape. Just not having been practicing and not keeping up the rhythms and the attunement. And that's why it says, Phanao Ujjashur Puti, the afflictions are bodhi. The Ujjashur is the good knowing advisor. Just has to be. And this is what it means to cross over the living beings of your own nature. You also cross over the bad knowing advisor with the good knowing advisor. So, yeah, it's really good. A lot of us made those mistakes in the 60s when we first came in, thinking, oh, well, we have the internal good knowing advisor, we have faith in ourselves, we were way over the top, we're already Buddhas. With the idea there was nothing more we needed to do, when in fact, if you just looked at us, it was obvious that we weren't Buddhas. We were basically questionable even as far as being fully human. But the potential was still there. And Jin Chuan a couple weeks ago gave a talk about Angulimala. Now, Angulimala was a serial killer. And yet, even an Angulimala with how many? 108 or something?
999.
199.
999.
999.
Is 1,000.
Yeah, I mean, this proficient serial killer, even at 999, was able to change and turn around. The Buddha didn't do that for him. The potential, although it was really shrunk and diminished, was still there. There was still a kindling of a spark of that could be then regenerated. So that's the range you have between a serial killer and a Buddha. The substance is actually the same. The functioning is not the same. The realization is not the same. But this is really important because otherwise, if we don't get this, we will continually look outside for salvation, or we'll also just throw in the towel and become nihilistic. And we won't be able to stay the course, because the first obstacle that comes up will say to us, oh, see, you didn't have it to begin with. You can't do it. So everything rests on having this confidence and cultivating the confidence. It's not just enough to have it. It has to be strengthened and reinforced. And every change for the better strengthens and reinforces, it actually confirms it. This is the wonderful, wonderful plasticity of these teachings. Okay, next week I want to talk about this next concept here, really important, is this joy, the Yao, that's expressed here. You're going to see this throughout these verses. And it's something that is, I think, can be underappreciated in these teachings. People say, oh, Buddhism is about suffering, the end of the suffering, life's impermanent, there's no self, blah, blah, blah. And it can turn into a very seemingly life-denying, depressive teaching. And yet, I want to look at these passages here because it's joy, delight, pleasure, well-being runs throughout them. So if we're doing that, we're actually doing a misinterpretation of something here. And that's important to correct. And often that comes from the lack of faith. The lack of faith. And then we think, okay, I'm no good, I'm innately depraved and incapable of da-da-da, I have original faulty crack lines in me, and therefore, and then no joy can come, no pleasure can come, no sense of well-being, because we constantly feel we're inadequate, lacking, incomplete, and that cannot be made whole again. So again, psychologically, this is much more important than the sort of the theological aspects of this. But tonight I'll stop here. And it's good to be back. Good to see everybody. I don't see everybody online. Good to see you. I don't know. Who's going to talk tonight?
I'm just going to share.
I'm stretching this over to you.
You possibly move the camera over here, or like kind of turn my second. Do this.
Is he dependent on this as well, or is it okay?
Oh, I need to bring the camera. Lots of technical. Okay. So welcome back as well. As Marty was talking about faith, and particularly faith of the Buddha, a sutta popped into my mind, and you can go look it up online. It's called the Avatamsaka Sutra, or the Inquirer. And I was just kind of getting some of the details here. It's a very interesting sutta because the Buddha asks his disciples to investigate him. And he says, the Buddha goes, what? We're honored one. How do you do that? And if you look it up, he says, well, first, you use if you can't actually read my mind, then you observe and you listen very, very carefully. He says, do you see any defilements at all? That's first. He said, you really look carefully. And he says, do you see anything that's mixed? There's some purity and there's some defilement. Or do you only see purity? So he asked the monks to look very, very carefully. Right? So it's the first. And then he goes on, he says, do you see that this was attained for a long time or just recently? Because maybe we were just putting on a show. I just realized this, I kind of put a little show on, and no, so it's a long time, okay? It says, now look, if the kind of the reputation or fame leads to a sense of pride or corruption. So, okay, so the Buddha starts saying, look at the fame. Does fame corrupt? Then he says, well, how about the sense of restraint, holding the precepts, living this life? Is there any fear involved? Is the restraint coming from fear? Is the non-indulgence coming from having no lust? Investigate. Look carefully. So it's actually, to me, it's very interesting that the Buddha exhorts his disciples to actually look very carefully at his own conduct. And he goes on and he says, now how about in different situations? Is this always the case? When the Buddha is by himself or he's with a large group of people? And he asked, how about with different kinds of monks? Some monks are really, but
I hope so too, because it's really good.
but if not, it's okay. We just accord with conditions. But may I just say very briefly, so essentially, the Buddha asked his monks to investigate his conduct. And then he has another level. He says, okay, so because you can't read my mind, then what you can do is you can ask me. He says, do you have any defilement, Buddha? And if you see if you trust his words, he says, well, no defilements. Mine is pure. And it doesn't stop there. Okay, so after you investigate very carefully, then you can listen to the Buddha and say, well, maybe I can try his teachings. And then Buddha then teaches you, and it works. And level by level, depth, going deeper and deeper, you have more and more insight. Just until you have direct knowledge of the Dharma. And then you have unshakable confidence. And then when people ask you, why do you have faith in the Buddha? You can truly say, because I have faith in the Buddha, I know the teachings, I have faith, trust in the Sangha. So that's how monks should inquire. So to me, it's very interesting about this faith in the Buddha. He's not just saying, okay, believe in me, I'm enlightened, everything's fine. Take the Kool-Aid. No, look very carefully. How am I acting in all aspects of my life? Not just when I'm in front of everyone else. Not just with people I like or people I think are well-trained. It's all aspects of our life. And to me, it's actually also a very useful reflection for ourselves who are on the spiritual path. Actually, what Jing Weishu just asked about, how do we trust ourselves, is that in this training, it's not about looking good for other people. What we're trying to investigate is how, you can say the Buddha within. Where is the place in ourselves that's truly pure? That's not doing things out of fear. I'm holding this kind of rule because I actually recognize its true benefit. I'm not indulging in sensual pleasures, not because I really want it, but maybe people will see me, so I won't do it. It's because I see through it. It's not interesting. And then I'm able to sustain this for a long period of time, because this takes practice, little bit by little bit. And as we cultivate that place in our own hearts, we can start to trust ourselves, as Jing Weishu was mentioning, or Marty was explaining. We can start to trust ourselves, and little bit by little bit, we can draw near that inner Buddha, the inner good and wise advisor, listen to his or her teachings to us, and little bit by little, maybe you realize some more clarity around our lives. And then we can say, well, we really trust ourselves. We can, I really trust myself, because I've seen that it works. I've seen that really leads to happiness and well-being. So you can look up that sutta, Avamtasaka Sutra, and I find it to be very instructive in terms of how do we go about learning the Dharma. Now, I was also saying maybe one thing is, I think it's extremely important in current times. I hear sometimes some stories of especially young people interested in the Dharma, and they get caught by teachers who actually take advantage of them. They promise some kind of fast shortcut. I'm going to give you some mantra and you're going to get enlightened quickly. Or maybe if you give me some kind of offering and I'll give you some kind of secret. Or you just might feel really special because they praise you. He's really a good guy because he really praises me a lot. And the sad part is people get manipulated out of their deep spiritual aspirations. And I think this sutta is very clear. You don't just trust somebody like overnight. You have to evaluate them for a long period of time, watching very, very carefully. So I think it's actually very important for current times, especially, who are spiritual seekers and really wanting to walk on this path. So maybe it's that much. I know, Marty?
Interesting, when I said before, when Ananda said who will be the teacher, because now you're gone. Now that you're gone, we have no teaching or teacher. And when the Buddha said, no, that's a wrong view, Ananda, it goes to the passage you just read. Because if you listen to the passage you just read, the Buddha was answering the question in the presence of the Buddha, not the absence. Where does authority, in the presence, authority resides on that examination discernment.
Yeah.
So if Ananda had been listening, he would have figured out already that that is a continuing authority that has to be investigated even in the time of the Buddha when the Buddha is present. So it's really matches. The other thing that's interesting in pointing out, your ability to see that in somebody, what the questions the Buddha is asking, is only as good as your honest and ability to see and recognize it in yourself. In other words, without cutting through your own phoniness, you won't be able to spot and cut through the phoniness of somebody else. It's wonderful, mutually rubbing. Okay, announcements. What's happening?
Well, we're pretty much starting our spring semester now, so all the classes are online. Tomorrow night we have Monk Heng Sure lecture on the Avatamsaka Sutra as well. I think what else we have interesting coming up. We just finished our Amitabha session. I don't think there's actually anything in addition that's going on in our schedule. Is there something, Jingwei, that I'm missing? Okay, yeah, we were asked to maybe do another pod on the four boundless hearts. As people know, at BBM, we've spent a lot of time on loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. And to really spend a week investigating what does that actually mean in our lives in a kind of a fun retreat format. So that will be in the end of March. If you want to find it, we'll have it on our website soon. But you can go to pod.servicespace.org/apply and you'll see links to that particular pod and sign up there if you wish. Yeah. Other than that, I think that's what's going on in the monastery. Our regular schedule is going on fully, so morning ceremony, meditation, followed by Dharma reflections. We've been reading the 3 Steps, 1 Bow journals, and 3 Steps, 1 Bow ourselves as a practice. And yeah, hope you can join us. Okay, so maybe dedicate. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the 3 jewels. Okay, wish everyone a good rest of the evening.